by James Ross, who is Legal and Policy Director at Human Rights Watch, where he has worked for over 2 decades. He previously worked for Médecins Sans Frontières in the Netherlands, Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe in Bosnia, the International Human Rights Law Group in Cambodia, and Lawyers Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. Jim is not only an alum of the Human Rights Program, but he is one of the founding students of the program, and he was subsequently also a visiting fellow. Let's welcome Jim Ross.
You'll note that a number of those organizations I worked for have since changed their names, so I think it was because of my work there. Good afternoon, everybody. 40 years ago, wow, a half a dozen law students put together a proposal for what they felt would be a strong human rights program at Harvard Law School. At the time, as far as I recall, these programs exist everywhere now, but at the time, as far as I know, there was a program only at Yale and at the University of Minnesota. So we put together a proposal, and I distinctly remember saying, hey, this covers a lot of ground. There's a lot of things we'd like to see in a program. The one thing it doesn't get us jobs in the field of human rights. Happily, I can say that those half dozen students who put together the proposal include Jessica Newworth, who's here today. She founded and for many years headed Equality Now. Steve Golub, who has worked in dozens of countries around the world on behalf of humanitarian agencies, foundations, government aid agencies promoting the rule of law, legal aid and the like in many different countries. Many of you may know Hillary Charlesworth, a longtime professor of international law and feminist theory in Australia, who's now a member of she's now a judge on the International Court of Justice, and Katie Zoglin, who worked for the ABA and Freedom House, among other things, working on rule of law issues in Morocco and Algeria. If you had asked me 40 years ago what Mikhail Matua would be doing now, I would have said, yeah, Mikhail, he'd be Kenya's president for life. So you've disappointed me, Mikhail, I have to say. As was noted, though, he's had a rather distinguished career as an international law professor and former dean at SUNY Buffalo School of Law. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't say more about Henry Steiner, who's already been mentioned. The proposal the students put together, I did think helped kickstart the program, the human rights program at Harvard. But it was really Henry who, with creativity and persistence and just a lot of hard work, created the program that we have today. And his role was immeasurable. And over the years, I've come to work with so many graduates, Harvard Law School graduates who are part of the program. Nazma Dirzadai, for example, Bonnie Doherty, who I work with, and she's not here today, and I think that's in part because I have to review a paper of hers on the horrors of incendiary weapons that she still owes me, so she's probably avoiding the conference. But really, many students who have done a lot for human rights. For those of you who are students who are still here, I would say my guess is that the issue that I confronted 40 years ago, how do I get a job in this field, is still there. And I'd say two things. First of all, the bad news is that your involvement in human rights is still very much needed. But secondly, you do now have a program, a full-fledged program that can really help you do that work and get you there. I'll just end noting some good advice I once got from the late Harold Berman, Professor Harold Berman, who was here. And he said to me, if you want to go into a field where there are very few opportunities, it's very important to don't keep your options open. And I think that was great advice, and I pass that on to you, and good luck in pursuing a career in human rights, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
So I now have the happy responsibility of introducing our greatly esteemed colleague, Kathryn Sikkink, who is going to provide the main event for this lunch, our keynote address that starts the day's events. Professor Sikkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a renowned international relations scholar, best known for her work on, and I have to glance down for this list because it's long, human rights, international norms, transnational advocacy networks, and social movements and transitional justice. She's the author of innumerable articles and books, but I want to single out the title of one of her fairly recent books for your attention, and that is Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century. When this program was founded, it was a difficult time for human rights. We are living now, in many ways, in a difficult time for human rights. But there is reason for hope, reason for hard work, even more so in difficult times. And with that in mind, I'm delighted to hand the microphone to Professor Sikkink.
Now, I had a PowerPoint which I sent ahead. Oh, great. So first, I feel really honored to be here today. As I look around at the people in the audience and we hear about the people in the audience, I feel all the more honored. But I want to begin first by just saying a really big congratulations to the Human Rights Program on its 40th anniversary. Abadir sent me some data. I'm not going to cite it all, but you have had, I think, 1,500 alumni of the program, 92 postgraduate fellows who've worked around the world, visiting fellows, thousands of students who got internships, and many others who have been influenced by the work of all the rest here. So human rights clinics and programs like this all around the world. And I should say, I was associated with that one in the University of Minnesota, which is one that existed before the Harvard one. So I have long experience, but really working first with that Minnesota clinic. I believe these programs and clinics are a backbone and a lifeblood of human rights work around the world. So I want us just to begin with applause. I want you to give applause for yourselves and for those who are new to this amazing program. Okay, second, I want us to take the title seriously, Envisioning. Not that title, this title, this title. The title, Envisioning the Future of Human Rights, okay? And so I'm actually going to do an exercise in the time granted to me to ask you to envision some, very briefly, I even brought 3x5 cards that we're going to pass out for you to jot things down on. I wish we had a whole session where we could do small groups, give feedback, et cetera, but we weren't given that much time. So, and so be ready to be envisioning the future. Now, Jerry already led us to understand this, but when I was asked to talk, I said, there's a lot of people there who know a lot more about the Human Rights Program than I do, virtually everyone in this room. And then I realized that, and I tried to talk him out of having me do this, and then I realized that no, there were just too many depressed people walking around in the human rights world. And because, and now you can change it, because I wrote this book, Evidence for Hope, in 2017, Jerry thought maybe I could talk about evidence for hope, not just hope, but evidence for hope. So I will do that in part, but I'm also going to try to I'm going to briefly talk about my more recent book. So I wrote Evidence for Hope, partly to respond to, and next slide, books like this, right? So our colleagues, right, Eric Posner, a lawyer at Chicago, The Twilight of Human Rights Law, my colleague Stephen Hopgood, a political scientist at SOAS in London, writing The End Times of Human Rights. And I wanted to respond because I felt these books, in particular, and a whole series of other things, were not very well researched to begin with. They were making very big claims on very thin research. But also there was kind of a logic that needed to be dissected about this literature, and that's what I was trying to do. But I think, these books aside, the disillusionment and even despair that many people are feeling is really serious. So I want to speak somewhat, not so much to these books anymore, but to that sense of disillusionment experience. And I had this walking in and seeing colleagues and people saying to me already, I've never been so much despair as I feel right now. Okay, so these are, as someone already said, difficult times. Every day is full of heartbreaking news, whether it be from Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Sudan, many more. And what I want to remind people is that, and the previous speakers got us started here, is that there's nothing new about difficult times. Okay, and I want to see the next slide, please. Okay, this actually comes from the 15th anniversary of the Human Rights Program. I love this photograph, okay, and here's Henry Steiner already and pointed out the founding director of the Human Rights Program. And these words, right, we can say as at once how much it has done, how little it has achieved. Surely the battles are endless. Rights have always been fights, but the movement has become a formidable combatant. The momentum lies with it. Okay, those words are every bit as important and as true today as they were when Henry wrote them back in 1999, right? At the same time, as there's this kind of despair, I've also not seen human rights so much in the news, and human rights and international humanitarian law and international courts, so much in the news as we see them today. Now, I teach a course at the Kennedy School called International Law and Global Justice. It's really the politics of international law. I have to do things like teach about the International Court of Justice over the years. And you guys may realize, when I first started teaching about the ICJ, it was, boring. Really hard to get my students to care at all about the ICJ. Well, now with cases like Gambia v. Myanmar, like South Africa v. Israel, all of a sudden the students are like going, tell us more about this court. So there is a lot of interest among students, among the general public, among the news about international law, human rights, international courts, et cetera. I have a database with my team on transitional justice around the world. We've just brought up to date to 2020. There are, continue to be dramatic advances in the number of transitional justice mechanisms used around the world, including truth commissions, including reparations policies, including vetting and lustration, and including domestic, foreign, and international prosecutions. Now, the piece I want to tell you, because I want your help thinking about this, is that the justice cascade itself, measured by actual human rights prosecutions, peaked in 2010 and has been going down. Okay. And so that's, we just got that data. I'm just working on an article right now. And so I have some hypotheses I want to, I'd like to briefly share with you and get some ideas from you later on maybe. And the complicated thing is it's not the same with reparations policies or truth commissions. Reparations policies and truth commissions are continuing on a very high level, and prosecutions have gone down. One explanation for this is one I gave in the book, The Justice Cascade, many years ago, and that is a precondition for the Justice Cascade was the third wave of democracy, okay? And the third wave, as you know, is over, there's no fourth wave, and without the bulk of the prosecutions in our database are domestic, and without that ongoing new transitions to democracy, those prosecutions are declining, okay? There's other issues too that may be driving it. For example, in the United States, we're prosecuting some mass atrocity issues as visa fraud, right? In France, they're prosecuting human rights under terrorism laws. It's easier to do, both visa fraud and terrorism are easier to do than it is to do human rights domestic trials. So there may be reasons of sometimes they're just finding alternative ways to prosecute human rights crimes. Okay, so how to address this issue of our sense that things have maybe never been so bad as they are today. Again, conversation started when we first walked in the door. I believe that it's partly due to the fact that we know more and we care more than ever before about human rights in the world, okay? So the human rights movement has done its job, and there's more and more human rights organizations, there are more and more human rights activists, they're doing their job, producing more and more reports all the time. We get something called information effects, and that is we know more by reporting on the ground. Also, the human rights movement has done its job in expanding the number of human rights that we're monitoring and making demands about more accountability and more compliance with those rights. And so this takes us back to, everyone has been started in 1984, and the dean already got us started on this saying, what was going on in 1984? So next slide, please. Here, the dean already told us, Dean Goldberg told us, like, the USSR was still a thing, he said. Apple was just being invented. But I want us to give us what was happening with human rights in the world at the time. The law was still recent and thin. There were few international courts. The covenants had been, I think, only in effect 8 years. Okay, in force, 8 years. A few new, there should be, you keep hitting, you should get more things here, yeah. There were some important new treaties, CERD, CEDAW, CAT had been drafted but was not yet in effect. But, what doesn't exist yet? Keep going, right? Lots of things didn't exist, okay, yet. And I think one of the crucial things to say is people, not just the Rome Statute didn't exist, people didn't even think it was possible in 1984 to ever have an international criminal court, right? The Convention on Disabilities, was still just a germ in someone's head, and the term LGBTQ didn't exist. 1988, I checked. LGBT, and it was LGBT, not LGBTQ. okay? So the term didn't even exist, much less demands for a treaty along these lines. So so one thing is just when this program was formed, it was a moment. It was a moment where we're still a long ways to go, and where so much has happened in that 40 years. And with the Human Rights Program really participating, I think, and the clinic participating in many ways in this progress, okay? So I just want to do like a thought experience. These are not the 3x5 cards yet, but do a little thought experience with you. And that is, many times people say to me, oh, back in the good old human rights days, back when things were things worked well. People, and I keep sort of saying, tell me exactly, give me a date. When were the good old days? And people often will say, oh, the 90s. The 90s were the good old days. And I said, oh, like when the genocide was happening simultaneously in the Balkans and in Rwanda, okay? And the dilemma is that people, we know, and this is, from psychological research, we know that humans have a tendency, a strong tendency to see negative information in the present, okay? We are extremely attentive to negative information in the present. There's good evolutionary reasons for that. Our deep ancestors who didn't pay attention to negative information, that is predators, didn't pass on their genes, okay? So there were good reasons to be attentive to negative information, okay? But, and we are also programmed in an evolutionary way to forget bad news in the past. There may be, I'm on shaky scientific grounds, there may be a reason for that around women and birth, okay? And that is, if women remembered giving birth, the species would not have also continued. But that combination, negativity bias in the present and hard time remembering negative information in the past, leads us constantly into the place we are today, which is to think that there was some good moment in the past if we could just return to it. So I just thought experiment, you guys are all experts, so thought experiment. When do you want to return to? Name the year for me. Think of the year. What year do you want to return to in the human rights past? And yes, I know there's some women who are going to say pre-Dobbs, okay? And every country has its own moment. My friends in Argentina want to say, before the current government, whatever. But not just thinking country by country, thinking in our human rights world, where do we want to go back to? And I'm not sure, I'm just saying, this is my point. I'm not sure that I can tell you a point I want to return to. And if so, we are in this imperfect world with all sorts of need for human rights, and we still, and yet we can't hark back to a golden age of the human rights past. That's what I would argue. Okay, now the moment, our envisioning moment, and I know, Kai, that we're running late already, right? We're okay? Okay, who's willing to help me pass out the cards? You got 5 cards, old style. I was going to do a poll everywhere and do a word cloud, but I was worried I couldn't make the technology work. Okay, and these are things you're going to write down, that where you'd like to see the Human Rights Program go in the future. We're going to just collect these and make them available to the Human Rights Program, so you know what all the smart people in this room would like you to do in the future. You can put your name on it. You don't have to put your name on it. And so I'm going to give you a minute to do that. I know you could talk a lot more, and I hope you will during the breaks, the half-an-hour breaks that you have about envisioning. So even though I know you can talk more, we're still sending Kai around to pick up cards. And I'm still giving you my informal hunches about the future of human rights, okay? So one hunch I have, and I think this is supported, I think, by literature in the field, and that is there will be fewer treaties. There will be fewer drafting of treaties. The work of the human rights movement, which in the first 40 years of this program was so much about drafting treaties, I think that's not gonna, the future's not gonna look that way. And it's not just that it's a bad moment for drafting treaties, okay? It's that we, compared to 1984 or compared to 1975, when literally we didn't, the tools weren't there, we have what one set of authors is called saturation of law, okay? Saturation of law. And so I think that what we'll see in the future is more attention to enforcement of existing law, less to drafting new law. These are for you guys, you get to keep them, actually. More enforce, and I have a student who's working on this, amending law. It turns out that there's a lot more amending than drafting. So that's the first piece. The second piece is there is going to be well-funded backlash. Okay, no one should go, oh my God, there's backlash. One, there's always been backlash. Okay, I mean, I remember when the Amnesty International group went to Argentina in what year was it, 78 maybe, and they were just called communists. Amnesty International were all communists, right? But the backlash, I remember when the Chilean backlash was so bad that they put a bomb in Orlando Letelier, Ronnie Moffat's car, and they killed US citizens on US soil. Okay, so backlash has always been there. I don't think it's new, but there is a particularly strong and well-funded backlash today, and it's partly because the anti-human rights movement has learned from the human rights movement. They were not as good initially about creating transnational advocacy networks in the world, and now they've gotten a lot better. And secondly, because the backlash is coming as a result of many successes of the human rights movement, okay? So I just heard a super interesting presentation of a political scientist, Christopher Velasquez, who's done research on the LGBT funding of the anti-LGBT movement globally. He's looking at 990 forms. He's looking at US tax forms, so he's got good data. And what he's showing is that it's after the marriage equality law passes in the United States that a dramatic upsurge in funding goes to groups working on international anti-LGBTQ activism. And so it's a direct evidence of how a success, at least success in one place like the US around marriage equality, has led to backlash funding. 10 times more funding is going to anti-LGBT community activism than in, let's say, supporting human rights support for LGBT activism around the world right now. So backlash is a reality, it is there, but it's partly backlash against success. Same thing, people asked me years ago working in Latin America, why is there no backlash against abortion? And I said, because abortion's illegal everywhere in the continent. There's no backlash because abortion is illegal. As abortion has legalized throughout Latin America, for example, we've got backlash, okay? So backlash will be with us. Human rights will always be about struggle. This is what Henry said in his, it'll always be about a fight, right? It's still always gonna be about a fight. No one should not expect that. And here is my most radical prediction, predict that human rights will continue to win hearts and minds, continue to have political, legal, and moral victories. Okay, now, I'm not just saying that out of wishful thinking, okay? I am drawing here on some research from my new book, 2021, new, not so new, but my more recent book, International Norms, Moral Psychology and Neuroscience. I felt the need to dig into moral psychology and neuroscience because I was always puzzled. Actually, I was puzzled by how many victories the human rights movement had had. Historically, everything from anti-slavery to women's suffrage, everything from the early movements around anti-apartheid, for example. And in our book, Activists Beyond Borders, my co-author Margaret Keck and I, said these were characterized by movements for equality of opportunity and protection from bodily harm. I then later came across a very interesting literature, this moral foundations literature from psychology, that says, indeed, this is research that says actually human beings, that morality is not only something learned, but morality is something that is shared by humans. There might have been good reasons for this as well. And two of the most important moral foundations are this notion of care and harm, right? So concern with fairness and freedom from harm. Now, then when I really looked at this literature, I learned that those are not the only moral foundations. There are also moral foundations about loyalty to clan and nation, sanctity and purity, and obedience to authority. Okay, so because of this, the backlash doesn't only come out of, let's say, bad intentions. The backlash also comes from other moral foundations. Okay, and so then you go, whoa, we're in trouble. They've got 3, we've got 2, whatever. But then in this book we research and saying, loyalty to clan and nation, it exists everywhere. Obedience to authority, demands exist everywhere. But they are parochial demands. People can agree you should obey authority. They don't agree what authority you should obey. Okay, it can be the Pope for some people, and it can be the Imam for some others. Okay, and so the thing about fairness and freedom from harm are that they are cosmopolitan and they can be internationalized, and they have been internationalized through international human rights law. Okay, and so we get backlash, but it's hard for those organizations pushing backlash to have an international and cosmopolitan vision that can gain support in the world. One quick example, and I'm ending. Russia had a campaign on traditional values. They're in the Human Rights Council. They got support for a study group of how traditional values should be used to support human rights. They got a big vote in favor, and people studying it knew that it was an effort that was supported by the Orthodox Church, and it was particularly aimed at LGBTQ communities and organizing, okay? But so the the committee that was assigned to study it came back and said, we know what human rights are, we don't know what traditional values are. There's no definition of traditional values. So no, we are not going to support this move to incorporate traditional values into human rights, because it is not a move that we can really get an international agreement on what that means. Okay, and this was an example of these obedience to authority kind of arguments that make a good. They succeed initially because it sounds plausible. They get lots of votes. And then when you try to think slowly and analyze, which you have to do, as you folks know, for drafting treaties, for doing international law, they can't do it because it cannot be created as a cosmopolitan demand. And so there's some hope, I'm arguing there's some hope, that these other moral foundations are parochial and will not be able to internationalize in the way that fairness and harm have been able to through the human rights law. And I will just leave you with that. I know there's no Q&A, but we'll move on, right? Thank you.